The huge major news that has been sweeping the entire world right now is the announcement by both US President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro that the two countries who've been in their own little Cold War since essentially the Cuban Revolution will now finally begin to normalize relations. They will now be opening embassies up in each other's countries. There will now be dialogue and cooperation between the two countries that have stood as enemies for so long. Some of the things specifically mentioned by both sides was the opening up of trade, easing travel restrictions between the two countries, and economic cooperation. For now, people will be allowed to send more money to their relatives inside Cuba, and that this opens up an entire new era of cooperation and transparency between the two countries. But the big question is, will the embargo against Cuba be lifted? I, like many people, are actually fairly confident that that will take place. And that after this long time, that unjust and inhuman embargo that has been placed against Cuba by the United States will finally come to an end. And a lot of people are rejoicing in that. But there are a lot of people like me who are still very skeptical of what's going on. This also comes with the announcement that the last of the Cuban Five, who were unjustly held in U.S. detention for about the last 15 years, will finally be released. In exchange, Cuba will release Alan Gross, essentially a saboteur for USAID, who has been held for quite some time now, will be released in a prisoner exchange. And there are also other prisoners that will be exchanged, but I'll save that for later in this video. Right now, let's take a look at what exactly it is Barack Obama said during his announcement of this historic moment.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas.
In other words, the plan that they've been carrying out all these decades didn't work. They didn't get what they want. What this is really about is exactly that, not getting what they want. This isn't about some kind of altruistic trying to be about freedom and democracy and whatnot. This is about getting imperialist interests. And that's very clear from his speech, and we'll show later from his speech that this is what it's all about. And I find it very strange that he would say that this is to the benefit of the American people. How will this be of benefit to the average American? It in fact doesn't really mean anything. It won't really do anything for the regular American person. But it will do a lot for American capital. And we know that this is what the expansion of American capital into Cuba is what this is really all about.
Proudly, the United States has supported democracy and human rights in Cuba through these 5 decades. We've done so primarily through policies that aim to isolate the island, preventing the most basic travel and commerce that Americans can enjoy anyplace else. And though this policy has been rooted in the best of intentions, no other nation joins us in imposing these sanctions.
Obama's words here are so terribly hollow. Are we supposed to believe that the United States is actually concerned about human rights, one of the greatest human rights violators in the entire world? Isn't it the United States government that's basically funded Omega 66 and other, Cuban exile terrorist organizations inside of Florida? They've cooperated with these groups, sometimes outright funded them and assisted them. If they were really so altruistic and cared about human rights and the livelihood of Cuban people, then why would they ever have blockaded food and medical supplies? This statement by Obama could not be any more false.
While I've been prepared to take additional steps for some time, a major obstacle stood in our way: the wrongful imprisonment in Cuba of a U.S. citizen and USAID subcontractor, Alan Gross, for 5 years. Over many months, my administration has held discussions with the Cuban government about Alan's case and other aspects of our relationship.
They're talking about the release of Alan Gross, a man who they claim was just doing his job. He was just building internet for people, and Cuba just couldn't stand that. Well, actually, he was working with USAID, which is a known organization that works with the U.S. government and for the U.S. government to undermine many countries around the world for U.S. interests. This is not me talking. This is a known fact. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. He was building an underground network with the specific purpose of undermining the Cuban government, undermining Cuban society. And if they were really so concerned about human rights and a normalization of relations, why isn't Luis Carriles being extradited to Cuba to face the crimes that he committed on behalf of the U.S. government? Now, this man carried out real terrorist activities, acts of state terrorism from the U.S. government for the U.S. government. Why isn't he being turned over?
In exchange for the 3 Cuban agents, Cuba today released one of the most important intelligence agents that the United States has ever had in Cuba, and who has been imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. This man, whose sacrifice has been known to only a few, provided America with the information that allowed us to arrest the network of Cuban agents that included the men transferred to Cuba today, as well as other spies in the United States. This man is now safely on our shores.
This right here is nothing short of an outright lie. The Cuban Five were agents sent in to try to track down and crack a drug smuggling ring that had been going on. They came forward with that information to give to the U.S. government to help stop the drug trafficking, some of which was coming through Cuba. So this cooperation in trying to stop a drug smuggling ring ended up with 5 Cubans being arrested and held for, God knows how long it's been now. I think it's been 15 years. All because they were fighting drugs, just to use as point scoring or something to hang over Cuba's head. This deliberate twisting of history to make the U.S. out to be heroes is nothing short of disgusting, to make themselves look like the victims. Sometimes I wonder if maybe that drug trafficking that they were trying to stop was actually the CIA shipping drugs.
Second, I've instructed Secretary Kerry to review Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This review will be guided by the facts and the law. Terrorism has changed in the last several decades. At a time when we are focused on threats from al-Qaeda to ISIL, a nation that meets our conditions and renounces the use of terrorism should not face this sanction.
The idea that Cuba was part of the axis of evil, a place that was responsible for state terrorism, is absolutely laughable and one of the most transparently false statements that the United States has ever made about another country. Cuba has done nothing but tremendously support countries around the world, sending free doctors to deal with all manner of things. I can point to the Ebola crisis. They've sent a couple hundred doctors. The United States sent 3,000 combat personnel. I think that speaks volumes. And exactly what state terrorism is Cuba responsible for? I can give you an unending list of state terrorism that the United States government is responsible for. The aforementioned Luis Carriles was a state-sponsored terrorist who bombed hotels in Cuba. And not to mention, practically the biggest state-sponsored terrorist organization in the world is probably the United States military, which has hundreds of, probably over 100 million kills under its belt. And to actually try to claim that Cuba is some kind of international, part of an international terrorist thing is just frankly ridiculous and smacks of being just complete and utter bullshit coming from the biggest hypocrite there could possibly be in the entire world.
The Cuban people and the emerging Cuban private sector. I believe that American businesses should not be put at a disadvantage, and that increased commerce is good for Americans and for Cubans. So we will facilitate authorized transactions between the United States and Cuba. U.S. financial institutions will be allowed to open accounts at Cuban financial institutions, and it will be easier for U.S. exporters to sell goods in Cuba.
That, right there, is what this is all about. No sense of altruism about freedom and democracy. This is all about money. This is all about commerce. This is all about industry. This is all about making money. This is all about the power of capital. More specifically, American capital, penetrating into Cuba as it has been trying to do since the revolution happened. Now, have no mistake, this is what it's really all about. I mean, this isn't about helping the Cuban people. If the United States government ever really cared about the Cuban people to begin with, would they have really put the embargo up in the first place? No. But these words ring more true than any of the others that he gives in this entire speech.
But I'm under no illusion about the continued barriers to freedom that remain for ordinary Cubans. The United States believes that no Cuban should face harassment or arrest or beatings simply because they're exercising a universal right to have their voices heard. And we will continue to support civil society there.
And again, we resort to the old attacking them on the grounds of supposed restriction of free speech, one that's usually not backed up with anything whatsoever. And I find that claim coming from the United States to be entirely ridiculous, considering how much repression of freedom of speech there is in the United States right now. Let me give you something else. Here's footage of a man loudly proclaiming his disdain for the Castro brothers, openly, in public, right in front of the police in Cuba, with absolutely no repercussion whatsoever.
Todos los que están aquí son opositores que están en contra del sistema. Nosotros lo que queremos es que los Castro renuncien. Es lo que queremos nosotros. ¿Ya me entiendes? Es lo que queremos. Mire, estamos luchando por eso. Porque esto es una verdadera Cuba libre. ¿Hasta cuándo el abuso que tienen con el pueblo? El agasajo que tienen. Así lo que tienen que renunciar ya, ¿verdad? Que han hundido el país. Lo han hundido ustedes, más nadie. Pues aquí.
Here we have a madman just going on about how he hates the Castros, and the police don't even care. And if we're going to talk about free speech, or the suppression of said free speech, or police repression for disagreeing, how many young black men have been recently killed by the government? For what? Most of whom didn't do anything, and were essentially executed by police on the spot, almost in the style of death squads. What's accused of happening in Cuba is actually happening in the United States. How many black men have been killed by simply disagreeing with the police? And yet here's this maniac screaming. Tell me how the protesters at Occupy Wall Street, a very useless liberal movement that didn't accomplish anything and was never going to accomplish anything, how were they treated by the police? How many of these Occupy protests where people just sat there and didn't do anything? Sit down protests, they call it. How many of them were beaten by police, thrown in jail, or pepper sprayed because they didn't agree with the government, or more specifically, did not agree with the interests of the capitalist class? And Occupy wasn't even asking for very much. They weren't asking for revolution. They weren't asking for something even radically different. All they were asking for was just a bit more equality. That's it. Just a little bit more economic equality, just to raise wages a little bit more, just a little bit more on the demand side economics. And that was enough for the US government to violently suppress people from freedom of speech. What it is that's claimed Cuba does. Yet we don't really see any evidence of that actually happening. Yet how long was this entire incident with Occupy? Actually, some of it is still going on to this day. Well, right now, the much bigger thing is the killings of young black men for simply, often, no reason whatsoever. And the people who were angry at, Michael Brown's murderer getting away, the police opened fire on them. The protesters weren't even being violent. Then the police attacked. Then the protesters became violent. Where was the freedom of speech then? Where was it that people were allowed to disagree with the government? It wasn't anywhere in that time. From the fact that the United States can even make this claim, it's just a bit sickening.
We continue to believe that Cuban workers should be free to form unions, just as their citizens should be free to participate in the political process.
Now, once again, Obama has his facts wrong about Cuba. In fact, Cuba actually does have unions. In fact, they have trade unions. And these trade unions can choose people to go and represent them inside government, can sponsor them for elections that actually do happen. Yes, it is a one-party state. But in fact, most of the people in the government aren't even actually party members. There actually is democracy, right from down municipal elections all the way to the top of the government. They are there. They're monitored by international groups. Frig, even Wikipedia acknowledges that they happen. And Wikipedia isn't really a reliable source of anything. And they still acknowledge that they're there. So this statement by Obama is absolutely fraudulent. And this from a people who, through two elections of Bush, were actually fraudulent themselves. Just look up the Supreme Court ruling, look up a documentary called Hacking Democracy, you'll see exactly what I mean. This from a country that essentially has one party, with two faces and two official names. Anybody who still believes that there's actually really a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is pretty deluded. So I don't know where they're getting off complaining that Cuba is a one-party state. It is the United States that is a one-party state, the party of capital.
To the Cuban people, America extends a hand of friendship. Some of you have looked to us as a source of hope, and we will continue to shine a light of freedom. Others have seen us as a former colonizer, intent on controlling your future. Jose Marti once said, "Liberty is the right of every man to be honest." Today, I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, the United States is the colonizer. You are the colonizer. And talks about how they look up to America. You mean the phony people that you created through that fake Twitter that got exposed as a plot? The one that the United States government admits was a plot? Or how about the endless funding of groups to be subversive towards the Cuban government? Or even the recent release of information showing how the United States government had invaded and ended up controlling to a large degree the rap, the hip-hop movement inside of Cuba with the specific intent of brewing dissent against the government, all for imperialist interests. Are those the people that look up to you, many of whom were just digital fictions? No. The Cuban people recognize you for what you are. You are the colonizers. You are the imperialists. There is a reason why the United States refers to Latin America as its own backyard, because it feels that it has some right to it as its own property, just as a backyard is, or backyard does. And how dare he actually invoke the words of Jose Marti about freedom, about truth. This from the government that has consistently lied about basically every war it's ever gotten into. How many tens of millions of people have died as a result of the lies the US government has put out? So where do they even get off? Where does he even get off making a statement like that? Absolutely nowhere. All this to call the Cuban government a lie.
But we believe that you should be empowered to live with dignity and self-determination.
I'm sorry, the destruction of self-determination? Isn't the entire US society is based on the removal of self-determination? How about the theft of land from Native Americans? The theft of land from Mexico? How about all of that? Talk about self-determination. This is what the United States thinks of self-determination. Belief in self-determination. This couldn't be any more hollow coming from the US government. A massive source of global inequality. A military force that has stomped across the entire world for hundreds of years, stealing territory, stealing people's countries, undermining and destroying their right to self-determination. When has the US ever put forward any kind of right to self-determination? That's right. During the Revolutionary War, when people had to die because they didn't want to pay taxes to a king. But if, say, red or brown people want to live, well, self-determination just kind of disappears out of the window. Or say if you live in Iraq and Afghanistan, you don't get self-determination there, do you? Thinking of the United States as some kind of defender of the right to self-determination, or even claiming to be a supporter of the right to self-determination, is nothing more than a laughable fraud. One thing I think speaks to the colonizer mentality of this speech is the refusal to acknowledge that the embargo was unjust. He doesn't mention how much damage it did. The only complaint that they have, the only complaint that he gave, is that it didn't get what they wanted. It didn't get U.S. businesses into Cuba. It didn't destroy Cuba. Now think about that wording. That wording speaks volumes. They only complained that it didn't get them what they wanted. Never mind that the whole embargo was inhuman. Hell, it's comparable to a war crime itself. But none of that matters. None of the suffering the Cuban people went through because of the embargo matters. Not being able to get what they want is the only thing that mattered. Now, as a comparison, let's see what Raul Castro gave in his speech about the situation. Fellow countrymen, since my election as the president of the State Council and Council of Ministers, I've reiterated on many occasions our willingness to hold a respectful dialogue with the United States on the basis of sovereign equality in order to deal reciprocally with a wide variety of topics without detriment to the national independence and self-determination of our people. This stance was conveyed to the U.S. government both publicly and privately by Comrade Fidel on several occasions, during which our long-standing struggle staging the willingness to discuss and solve our differences without renouncing any of our principles. Well, unless you consider allowing foreign capital to come into your country and exert a tremendous amount of power, letting them buy up entire businesses, over 51% of the shares. Allowing a foreign country, particularly a gigantic imperialist one like the United States, to have serious economic clout. And you don't feel, or even other countries for that matter, and he doesn't feel that this is kind of a betrayal of what the spirit of the revolution was about. The heroic Cuban people, in the wake of serious dangers, aggressions, adversities, and sacrifices, have proven to be faithful and will continue to be faithful to our ideals of independence and social justice. Strongly united throughout these 56 years of revolution, we have kept our unswerving loyalty to those who have died in defense of our principles since the beginning of our independence wars in 1868. Today, despite the difficulties, we've embarked on the task of updating our economic model in order to build a prosperous, sustainable socialism. And by this he means the actual dismantling of socialism. You can't very well claim to be a socialist country when you're literally building a bourgeois class. Now, this is something that a lot of people haven't been really ready, something a lot of communists haven't been really ready to acknowledge yet. Cuba has been on a revisionist line for some time now, starting a little bit before Castro actually retired, but massively accelerated under Raul. I mean, it isn't even just like the usual Titoist line, where you have these like illusions of socialism, which is still essentially market capitalism. This is outright capitalism. And that's exactly what they're doing. And I can expect nothing but more of this to proceed if this beneficial relationship between the United States and Cuba continues. As a result of dialogue at the highest level, which included a phone conversation I had yesterday with President Obama, we have been able to make headway in the solution of some topics of mutual interest for both nations. As Fidel promised on June 1st, when he said, "They shall return," Geraldo, Ramon, and Antonio have arrived today in our homeland. The enormous joy of their families and all of our people who have relentlessly fought for this goal is shared by hundreds of solidarity committees, groups, governments, and parliaments, organizations, institutions, and personalities who, for the last 16 years, have made tireless efforts demanding their release. We convey our deepest gratitude and commitment to all of them. President Obama's decision deserves the respect and acknowledgement of our people. In truth, what the United States has done with the Cuban Five has been nothing more than a crime, an outright crime. There is no credit or thanks that should be given to Obama for finally reversing the tremendous horror that the United States has committed. This is like saying, well, a convicted killer of like 50 people turned himself in. Therefore, all is forgiven. This is just simply ridiculous. This is pandering to Obama on some of them, just a tremendously sickening level. At no point should this kind of attitude, this mentality, be taken towards an imperialist power, particularly one that has caused such suffering, not just in his own country, but all through Latin America, all through the entire world? To even hear Raul Castro speak so highly of Obama makes me sick. I wish to thank and acknowledge the support of the Vatican, most particularly the support of Pope Francisco in the efforts for improving relations between Cuba and the United States. I also want to thank the Government of Canada for facilitating the high-level dialogue between the two countries. Yes, Stephen Harper, as if I didn't have enough reason to hate you as it is. I find this all very interesting that it should be the Government of Canada under a conservative Stephen Harper who is the one to reach out and make this happen, to essentially help organize and get the ball rolling for Cuba to open up to foreign capital. One of the big things in Canadian history, political history, is Pierre Trudeau and his notorious good relationship with Fidel Castro. And this has been one of the things that has always made the Liberal Party of Canada just that little bit more humane. They were never a part of that monstrosity that the United States pushed. And that this great symbolic leader of compassion and whatnot about being with Cuba, with Pierre Trudeau, that now the opposite of that, the dismantling of socialism, is coming from a conservative. I guess this is their historical answer to that. This is Stephen Harper's moment to give the middle finger, not just to the liberal history there, but also to Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau's son, who seems to be running against him. And I guess this is the big conservative moment in history for them, like it was for the Liberal Party, when Pierre Trudeau shook hands and was friends with Castro. In turn, we have decided to release and send back to the United States a spy of Cuban origin who was working for that nation. On the other hand, and for humanitarian reasons today, we have also sent American citizen Alan Gross back to his country. Unilaterally, as has always been our practice and in strict compliance with the provisions of our legal system, the concerned prisoners have received legal benefits, including the release of those persons that the government of the United States has conveyed their interest in. We've also agreed to renew diplomatic relations. This in no way means that the heart of the matter has been solved. The economic, commercial, and financial blockade which causes the enormous human and economic damages to our country must cease. Through the blockade has been codified into law. The President of the United States has the executive authority to modify its implementation. We propose that the government of the United States, the adoption of mutual steps to improve the bilateral atmosphere and advance towards the normalization of relations between our two countries, based on the principles of international law and the United Nations Charter. Cuba reiterates its willingness to cooperate in multilateral bodies such as the United Nations, while acknowledging our profound differences, particularly on issues related to national sovereignty, democracy, human rights, and foreign policy. I reaffirm our willingness to dialogue on all these issues. I call upon the government of the United States to remove the obstacles hindering or restricting ties between peoples, families, and citizens of both countries, particularly restrictions on traveling, direct post service, and telecommunications. The progress made in our exchanges proves that it was possible to find solutions to many problems. As we have reiterated, we must learn the art of coexisting with our differences in a civilized manner. This statement of civilized coexistence is essentially the Khrushchevite revisionist line, where imperialism is now no longer a global contradiction, but something that they can easily live with side by side. This is essentially the abandonment of internationalism. This is the final capitulation to the imperialists. This is also what Mao did in his later years. Although, to be fair, Mao saw it as a part of his three worlds theory, which was absolutely awful, where he believed that allying with the United States against the Soviet Union was a good idea, which it wasn't. There was a normalization of relations, or living peaceful coexistence with the imperialists in order to attack the Soviet Union, which was a really stupid theory. But that's how it did arise in both China and the Soviet Union. This is a revisionist capitulation, straight up, and cannot be seen as anything else. We will continue talking about these important issues at a later date. Thank you. Something I find very interesting about all this is the actions of Pope Francis during this time. Now, it's said that he, and I tend to believe, that Pope Francis had a big hand in helping this situation come about. Now, frankly, what we're really saying is that Pope Francis gave a mutual neutral ground for both parties in which they could talk. In fact, it's said that meetings took place this past autumn on Vatican territory. Okay, well, that does certainly make sense. It is relatively a neutral ground for both parties. But that's all they really did. You know, the Vatican didn't make this happen. They're not like a broker that actually got this deal coming out. In fact, you might even be able to say Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, probably had more of a hand in that. As some kind of a broker, probably made some kind of deals with both the United States and Cuba as well. But I think that's part of this whole image of Pope Francis, just going right out there and doing stuff that shocks, whether he may or may not actually believe in what he's saying. Sometimes I really question whether or not he really does believe in the things that he says. But I think this is another part of that big rehabilitation of the church's image. Remember, it was Pope John Paul who was all like, yeah, communism is like a really bad thing, but then supports basically imperialist conquest, completely sucked up to the ruling class. I mean, it's not like the Pope stands on a gigantic fortune, right? No? And was angry at the Soviet Union for confiscating the money, the riches that frankly, the church and many churches had extorted from the people. Yeah, he actually was a really big scumbag. But I think this is the 180, where Pope Francis reverses that and continues to do more and to try to build up his image, build up the image of the church from this backward Stone Age theocracy that has a really bad history of mass murder and pedophilia, and turn this into a whole updated, fresh new thing that's totally with the people. And I think this act on the part of the Vatican is just basically it, trying to get its hand into something that could try to repair its image. Now, as you can imagine, the Cuban exile community really isn't all that happy about this. In fact, they're pretty outraged. Although, honestly, there's not really a lot of protests going on about it. Even the media has noted that the resistance to it from the exile community in Miami hasn't really been that much. Perhaps it's because they know this isn't a capitulation to Cuba at all. I think they really see this for what it is. The final crumbling of socialism in Cuba, now that it's been fully betrayed by Raul Castro. There are some, though, that are really upset about this. And they have taken to the streets in anger and ferocity, like, how dare you give a pass to the Cuban government for all it has done. Which I find absolutely ridiculous, because most of it was completely fabricated by them, too. And to listen to their whining, we escaped this terrible country, blah, 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 blah. Through repression that largely didn't exist. And a lot of them were actually just convicted criminals. People who were drug trafficking, but they make themselves out to be these poor victims who disagreed with the government. Yet this footage that we just previously saw showed what garbage that was. They don't just come down on people for writing something. The whole friggin' underground hip-hop scene was basically run by the U.S. government. Social media designed to try to overthrow the country was run by the United States. So where was the brutal repression behind that? Again, I can just imagine what's happening in the minds of a lot of right-wingers, particularly in Washington, D.C. And they're probably going out furious right now and trying to grab more and more dollars from their corporate donors or their hate group donors, trying to see what they can do to possibly reverse all this or try to prevent Obama from having some kind of executive order. And I can just maybe picture what's going through Glenn Beck's head right now, because, he's really not all there most of the time. I can imagine he's probably out somewhere right now, running through the streets like a manic depressive Paul Revere, ringing his bell saying, "I told you he was a commie, I told you he was a commie." He's probably out there doing that somewhere right now, losing his goddamn mind. Even with all the prisoner exchanges that are still taking place, there are two very important names that are still to be discussed with this matter. Carriles, He is the known terrorist who's carried out terrorist attacks in Cuba on behalf of the U.S. government, a real sponsor of state terrorism. This man has been running from his life from the Cuban government. Previously, he hid in Venezuela, and then the revolution happened, and he took off again. But who exactly is this guy, and what exactly did he do? He helped organize the Bay of Pigs invasion. After it failed, became an agent for the CIA. He received training at Fort Benning from 1964 to 1968. Was involved with a series of bombings and other anti-Castro covert activities. After migrating to Venezuela in 1968, Posada spent the years until 1985 involved in various terrorist activities in the region. Until 1976, he continued to have ties to the CIA. He was convicted in absentia in Panama of involvement in various terrorist attacks and plots in the Americas, including the 1967 bombing of a Cuban airline that killed 73 people. However, he was always denied involvement. Along with Orlando Bosch, he was also involved in the founding and coordination of the United Revolutionary Oppositions, described by the FBI as a terrorist outfit. Even the FBI acknowledges that it was a terrorist outfit. In 1985, he reestablished links to the CIA and moved to Central America, where he became involved with the United States to support the Contras, and later admitted to playing a part in the Iran-Contra affair. In later years, he admitted involvement in a string of bombings in 1997, targeting fashionable Cuban hotels and night spots. In addition, he was jailed under accusations related to an assassination attempt of Fidel Castro in Panama in 2000, although he was later pardoned by Panamanian President Mira Morosco in the final days of her term. He's also denied involvement in the airline bombing and the alleged plot against Cuba and Panama, but has admitted to fighting to overthrow the Castro government in Cuba. I think it's probably safe to say that he won't be turned over to the Cuban government anytime soon, or at all. And he is one of the prime examples of U.S.-sponsored state terrorism, one that nobody seems fit to really call them out on. It's only really alternative media that's actually bringing this up. Now, there is another name that's connected to this whole situation that should be brought up. Joanne Chesimard, a.k.a. Assata Shakur, the woman who was falsely convicted of killing a police officer in 1973 as she was carrying out a bank robbery. Again, this video wouldn't have the time to go into everything relating to her case. The information proving her innocence is out there, and you can find it. It would just be inefficient to put it in here right now. But it's interesting to note that the New Jersey State Police are chomping at the bit at the possibility of getting their hands on her once again. After all, she was convicted, sentenced, managed to escape prison, and made her way to Cuba. We continue to work closely with the FBI towards the capture of Joanne Chesimard, a convicted felon and fugitive who escaped from jail in 1979 and remains on the FBI's most wanted terror list, as well as New Jersey's most wanted list. We view any changes in relations with Cuba as an opportunity to bring her back to the United States to finish her sentence for the murder of New Jersey State Trooper Werner Foster in 1973. We stand by the reward money and hope that the total of $2 million will prompt fresh information in the light of this altered international relationship. Well, a lot of people think that it's very unlikely that the Castro government will actually turn over Assata Shakur, and they may be right. However, I do wonder how much Luis Carriles is actually worth to them. Would they really turn her over to get their hands on him? Would the United States actually turn him over? That might be a pretty worthwhile trade in their eyes. However, I don't think it's going to happen, because Luis Carriles has too much knowledge. He has worked too closely with the U.S. government for too long, has been involved in too many of their illegal actions, many of their terrorist actions, including the work with the Nicaraguan Contras, who went around raping and murdering nuns, and who carried out some of the worst atrocities of all time in Latin America underneath Reagan. So I don't find it very likely that he's going to be turned over in exchange for Assata Shakur. So I think both of them are probably pretty secure where they are right now. I sincerely doubt anything is going to happen to either one of them. And at least in terms of these two individuals, I don't think there will be any kind of exchange. As I said previously, Alan Gross is a part of USAID, which is a U.S. force for destabilization. Now, suddenly, the head of USAID is quitting for unspecified reasons. Rajiv Shah, the man in charge of USAID, defends his legacy of actively carrying out operations in Cuba. Many of those activities were outright subversive activities with the specific aim of carrying out U.S. imperialist interests inside of Cuba. Their whole point was to try to destabilize the socialist system in the country. And these are activities that the U.S. government has already admitted to. These aren't even conspiracy theories. They're now openly accepted. I recall most specifically the Zanzuno, the Cuban version of Twitter that USAID was trying to build in order to manipulate the system to... It's a text-based service, kind of like Twitter, but it was kind of like a combination of news and other stuff with the specific purpose of using sports reporting to eventually slide into politics and then eventually try to destabilize the country through subversive actions. This is, of course, well, pretty greasy, and would be considered an act of terrorism if any other country did it to the United States. And what is possibly one of the worst pieces of manipulation overall is USAID's admission that it attempted to, and it basically did, have control of the entire hip-hop rap scene in Cuba. And they gave amounts of money to twist the rappers' views. You know, we'll give you some money if you just do this like anti-Castro thing. Well, if you just do this anti-communist thing, you know, we can help you out financially there. And that basically it showed once again, as the CIA did in the United States, funding postmodern art with the specific purpose of challenging the intellectual scene in the Soviet Union. Again, another program which has been admitted to have existed. This really shows the entire imperialist objective it has. And this is all bound up with Alan Gross and his actions with trying to build an underground network in order to destabilize Cuba. He says he was just building internet. Well, actually, Venezuela's doing that right now, and his help really isn't needed. But this is specifically what Shah had to say. I have been privileged to work with a talented team of extraordinary colleagues over the last 5 years. Every day on the front lines of poverty and conflict, they demonstrate through their actions and sacrifices that we are an exceptional nation. I am grateful to each other and every one of them. As we ensure a smooth transition in leadership, I am more confident than ever in the lasting effect of our work to enrich lives and change our world for the better. You can't help but feel that it's not a coincidence that he just happens to be stepping down as the leader right now. Right now, as Cuba is opening up relations with the United States. Well, I mean, come on. One of the things Obama said was that to get programs like these easier access to the country. So he's leaving when his job is getting easier? That really doesn't make sense to me. Or perhaps the entire goal of the project that he was running was to be underground and subversive, which was the whole point of the program to begin with. And now that it can begin acting out in the open, it doesn't have to hide its malicious intent. He's not wanted anymore. Perhaps he had the particular skills of doing this kind of subversive activity underground. And now that it's no longer underground, his talents aren't needed there anymore. And they can have somebody who's more politically friendly, someone who has a better chance of doing things openly, someone who has the charisma or something like that can do it. Maybe his talents are now needed somewhere else, where the same kind of operation, and there's tons of programs and NGOs which do this very same thing that he's probably going to end up working for. We don't really know, but I would be willing to bet anything. In the end, he'll end up working for another one of these groups, carrying out subversive efforts in other countries. Well, we should certainly face the facts that the United States is looking to put through a color revolution, the known color revolutions like in Kiev and Hong Kong and all the other places they've been carried out inside of Cuba. And they would certainly jump at the opportunity to do so. The most prime example, I mean, the best time that they would do it is most certainly waiting for the death of Fidel Castro to carry it out. And I think Cuba is well aware of that. And I'm sure Raul is well aware of that too. And that's what I think he's doing here. I think he's trying to preempt them. I think he's naively trying to take what he sees as inevitably coming and trying to see if he can outpolitic the United States. Cuba has everything to lose from this and very little to actually gain. Well, very little to gain if you're in the interest of keeping the revolution alive. I think what's really going on here is that Raul thinks he can outmaneuver the United States. That he's going to play their political game, let them have what they want. But in the end, he's going to outmaneuver them to get what he wants. But that's not going to happen. He's not coming from the position of strength that the United States is. I mean, come on. Outside of China, there's not really any countries that can rival the kind of political clout and economic clout that the United States has. And Cuba has always been a tremendous symbol of resistance, such a tiny little island, resisting the greatest power in the world right next door to it. And that has always given it such an air of credibility and strength, and frankly honor, because they could stand up to that power that's so close to them, the greatest power in the world. And they have always resisted, no matter what has ever been done to them. But I think that's a serious mistake that's happening right now. I truly believe that Raul thinks that he can outmaneuver the United States, and it's all going to backfire in his face. Many have tried this. For example, Gaddafi, when they began the operations against him, he thought he could try to outmaneuver them by giving up his weapons of mass destruction. Very, very minimal ones. And that would, maybe get the UN off his case, or maybe loosen the hostility that's toward him internationally, if not at least the United States. Then maybe other people would start seeing how it was unnecessary. And what happened to him? He ended up with a knife in his anus, and his country absolutely destroyed. It didn't work. This is the same thing that we're seeing right now with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He's making concessions to those same powers that are trying to destroy him and destroying his entire country. Every single accusation of him having used a chemical weapon has turned out to be false. And in fact, the UN pretty much proved that it was coming from the FSA the entire time, the sarin nerve gas attack. But what did Bashar al-Assad do? He handed over the chemical weapons as a kind of concession to try to get them to loosen up on him a bit. So maybe the international scene will go a little bit easier on him. Oh, see, look, he's giving up the chemical weapons. Is it really worthwhile doing all this to his country just for that? And he doesn't even have them anymore? Yes. And look what's happened since then. They've just continued doing it. One of the few bargaining chips that Assad actually had was the fact that he still had chemical weapons. He still had a weapon of mass destruction that he could have used in the most dire of circumstances. It's that one thing he could kind of hold over their heads. That maybe if he couldn't win, he could take out the enemy with him at the same time. But now that's gone. In every one of these situations, or particularly this one, the Yanukovych yes moment, when he saw his ouster coming, his country being threatened by a color revolution, what did he do? He decided to work with them, take advice from them, cooperate with them over the government. Where is he now? That is the mistake that every one of these men has made. They attempted to compromise, to work with, or to allow the color revolution of US imperialism in their country at some point or another. They made a capitulation that ended up destroying them and destroying their nation. This is not what China is doing with Occupy Hong Kong. China stayed fast. They stayed to the truth. They actually were trying to give more democracy to Hong Kong. And that can be seen in the most unbiased of sources, even some biased ones against China admit it. But China never capitulated to it. They always maintained their sovereignty and did not enter into negotiations with the color revolution type movement that was being carried out at the behest of the United States. That is the mistake that Raul is taking right now. He thinks he can outmaneuver the United States by taking them in, manipulating them to get what he wants. If history has shown us anything, that does not work. the puppet strings to control the local comprador bourgeoisie, or the elites in Cuba. Those strings are coming down right now. And what Raul thinks he's going to do is manipulate the puppet masters that are coming in from the United States. But let's face it, the United States has a much better track record, a much better history, and a hell of a lot more power at being manipulative than the Cuban government has. The Cuban government has always been very cooperative with the people they work with, not manipulative. This is why I think Raul Castro doesn't know what he's doing. On the surface, it appears as though the deal was relatively fair and even, with both sides getting what they want, plus the future prospect of limitless mutual benefits through the restoration of relations. And sure, Cuba regained its 3 heroes, the remaining Cuban Five. But this was a symbolic success for the government. But it's the U.S. that really called the shots in this deal. It dictated which of the 53 political prisoners would be released, another condition for the restoration of ties. And not only that, but they're free to walk around the island and go right back to their subversive activities. This is an outright stupid move on the part of Raul. What he should have done at the very least was kick them out of the country. In essence, Raul just created 53 untouchable Aung San Suu Kyis. But they're all guaranteed to form the core of a public color revolutionary elite. As you recall, she was one of the big ones in Myanmar that facilitated change, part of another color revolution. Someone that you just couldn't touch. And now, there's 53 of them running around Cuba. After all, so much global publicity has been expended on this deal, that there is close to no possibility that Raul's government would take the risk of rough handling them in the future. He's not going to touch them. Regardless of the provocations, as the global information warfare potential against the government would be too great at that point, he walked right into a trap. And the imminent color revolution will now either sweep him out of power, or he'll be forced into conceding everything away and dismantling his country by his own hand, as dictated from abroad via the international and now permanent proxies. Cuba has always stood very proud as a resistor of imperialism, and its ideology has always been very strong to that effect. And it's always had this very good air of credibility, this respectability, because it has been so markedly disadvantaged in its position against the United States, economically, politically. And that's one of the things that made the Cuban people so strong, was the fact that they could resist all of this, and they could keep their own autonomy through this whole debacle of inhuman sanctions and embargoes. But on the other side of that coin, that comes with a tremendous weakness as well. Not having access to capital and resources necessary to transform an entire country to the degree that they would like to. It has happened to a very large degree, but not anywhere near what they really need, and not anywhere near what they would really like. This sudden orientation towards the United States, to me, seems like an utter betrayal to Venezuela. This is a betrayal of Venezuela. The magnitude of these talks, how much of a shift in global relations, how much of a global shift in political power this is actually going to carry out. I mean, this is huge news, and I think it's actually bigger than people realize. This was all done extremely secretively. No one knew this was happening. No one. Not even inklings here and there. This was all done so far under the radar, it's ridiculous. I'll bet Venezuela never saw this coming. I bet Maduro had no clue that this was going on. And what this does is this makes Cuba betray its multipolar world, where there were multiple powers that could all maneuver as they please, so that nobody could gain one real power advantage over everyone else. All of this intended to be that subversive activity to U.S. hegemony. A multipolar position that now no longer exists. Well, it does exist to some degree, but a major power player politically, because of the credibility they had, has been Cuba. And all those countries that have been by their side who have been a part of that resistance to U.S. imperialism. Venezuela, Bolivia, to a degree, Ecuador, and all the other countries. They're now all being betrayed. Where's their cooperation now? Their resistance to U.S. imperialism, U.S. capital dominating their country, when now one of their most important political allies, Cuba, has completely sold out to them. This could very well lead to the collapse of Venezuela. How do we know 6 months or a year from now the United States isn't going to carry out some kind of color revolution and take over the country and then turn around and block off all of its trade with Venezuela, hurting them even more? And they're taking a pasting right now from U.S. sanctions, economic sabotage, acts of terrorism. What happens if they lose one of their most important political allies, one of their most important trade allies, Cuba? We could witness Venezuela fall because of these actions. In fact, this whole global, southern global resistance of South America to U.S. imperialism, their very small resistance block they had built up with a few countries, could collapse because of this. And that's a very real threat. I think it's actually very possible that Raul didn't just sell out his country. He sold out all of Latin America by his actions. He may have stabbed our America entirely in the back. I can't help but also notice that there's probably a great deal of maneuvering against Russia in this situation. Because of that multipolar world, Cuba has allied with Russia for quite a while now. And this animal's claw from the U.S., this eagle talon, digging its way into Cuba, is a huge swipe to that Russian influence that was in the country. I mean, think about it. This is a global power play. And all these smaller countries, even Russia can't stand against the United States by itself. It needs China, it needs Venezuela, it needs Cuba, it needs all these other places. Cuba has always been a nexus for this kind of thing. And now with this, there's been a huge power play against Russian interests, against Russian influence inside Latin America. Because all of its influence basically had to do with the anti-imperialist kind of bloc that was in Latin America. If this key aspect of it falls, if this is the important brick that collapses the wall of the bloc, Russia's influence is gone too. I can't help but think that maybe the United States stepped in this situation, specifically agreeing to certain concessions. It didn't make that many of them at all, just to undermine Russian power in this region. And I think that's probably a big part of it as well. Now, I also think about the irony of this. During the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the revisionists should have stood stalwartly by Cuba in its time when it was being threatened by the United States. But what did they do? They stabbed them right in the back. The revisionists stabbed Cuba in the back by taking the nuclear weapons out of the country. Now, isn't it rather ironic that now Cuba is stabbing its ally, Russia, right in the back? Do I think this was a planned thing to get them back for the Cuban Missile Crisis? No. But this is the way global politics works. Hey, this is what happens. It's just an irony that's come around to resurface once again, a bit of unintended revenge, poetic justice maybe. Russia betrayed Cuba in a very desperate moment when it was under its biggest threat from U.S. imperialism. Now, isn't that what's happening right now? Russia is in a terrible position with this conflict with imperialism. The price of the ruble has dropped tremendously. Oil prices are kicking the country's ass. They're really suffering right now, and they could be on the verge of collapse. I don't fully know, but I know they're taking a pounding right now. They're in a terrible position. And what has Cuba just done? Basically just stabbed them in the back when they are in a desperate situation. Is it irony or justice? I guess in this case it's a matter of perspective. Now, I know what a lot of communists are saying right now, that this move is just meant to ease some of the economic problems that the country is facing right now, that this is a kind of NEP, the new economic policy, similar to what Lenin put through in the Soviet Union's early days. I would actually argue that that's a false comparison. In fact, I would say it's somewhat similar to, or closer to, what China did when they opened up about 20, 30 years ago, when Deng Xiaoping finally sold out the entire country. The new economic policy is not the same thing as what's happening in Cuba right now. When the NEP came in, Lenin used very specific words when describing it. He said, to begin again from the beginning. In other words, the launch of the socialist offensive to socialize the country, the means of production, farming, collectivization, everything, didn't work. They did it wrong. And why not? It's the first time anyone had ever attempted something like that. To think everything would go off without a hitch the first time is foolish. To think capitalism just worked is foolish. It had to go through a hell of a lot of suffering just to build itself. So Lenin used the phrase, to begin again from the beginning, that the top of the peak is where the revolution is going. He didn't say, we'll go down to a lower level and then come down and go back up again with a better path. He said, to begin again from the beginning, to go right to the bottom, to the roots, and begin that climb all over again. There was a dismantling of socialism to a very large degree, only so that they could re-industrialize or re-attempt the collectivization of the country. And that was the point, to do it better the second time, or to get it right the second time. And then eventually they carried that all the way through with the industrialization under Stalin, the eventual defeat of the Nazis, the collectivization of the land thanks to the bloody kulaks. China's situation was a pure selling out. Deng Xiaoping outright just gave the country away. Very slowly, but he did. But they've always kept a particular nationalist fervor while selling the country out. I don't believe that's the case with Cuba right now. Cuba already did it. Cuba got socialism. They've already achieved it. That socialism has slowly been dying, due largely to the embargoes, because of the BS that's been carried out against them by US imperialism. And that capitalism has been very slowly restoring itself in Cuba. There's just no question of that. Private property, now foreign companies or foreigners can purchase up to 51% of the assets of a single company. Shares and stocks in it. Stocks, shares, in a socialist country? Think about that. Socialism has already been dismantled. This is not a good sign. What people are forgetting is the context in which all of this is taking place. This is not some great victory. This is a monumental concession. Cuba already did socialism. It already got there. This is happening at a time of dismantling socialism. And that's probably the most very telling thing in this situation. No one here is a fool. No one here doesn't know what's going to happen. Obama's words were very specific. Essentially, all of Cuba, what the United States is planning, is to have the whole country be turned into a special economic zone. Whether Raul Castro is overtly selling out the country, or he thinks he can manipulate the imperialist power to get what he wants, in either case, it is not going to go well for Venezuela. You can't play a power game with somebody who's that much more powerful than you. That's not how power works. Raul's going to find himself in the midst of a color revolution. He's either going to have to sell out and do the United States bidding, or he's going to find himself dead like Gaddafi. And all of Cuba is going to turn right back into what it was before. And it's going to prove Fidel Castro right. History will absolve me. History will prove that what he did is right. And it will show what Raul Castro did, or is doing, is wrong. We know from a massive amount of foreign capital flowing into the country, purchasing up businesses, purchasing land. How long do you think it's going to be before peasants start getting thrown off of their farms? Because there are many still very fiercely independent small farmers inside of Cuba who've always maintained that very independent spirit. How long before the Constitution gets changed? The same thing that was done in Mexico, where the peasants could be thrown off of their land to be sold to a multinational corporation, particularly an American one, probably British and Canadian as well. How long before that happens? How long before we start having huge amounts of landless peasants going into the cities in Cuba looking for work? U.S. companies are then going to swarm in with disgustingly low wages. Because what are they going to do? They were deprived of their own means of production, the means of their own subsistence. They're now forced to sell their labor power to a foreign power, no less. And mark my words, this is what's going to destroy Cuba. Raul Castro is not going to outmaneuver them. We know what happens when you let foreign capital into your country and let it have that kind of power. He's not going to outmaneuver them. They are going to outmaneuver him. Everyone in the world is familiar with what it means to be a friend of the United States. Saddam Hussein found that out, what it meant to him. As a final note, what people aren't taking into consideration is the context in which this is coming to an end. And in all probability, the embargo is going to come to an end too. But what is the context in which the embargo is coming to an end? It's coming to an end with concessions by Cuba. The United States isn't saying, okay, we were wrong, we should never have had this embargo to begin with. They're saying the embargo didn't work. The embargo didn't get us what we want. So we entered into talks with Cuba to get stuff out of them. And they're going to win. This wasn't an admission of them being wrong. It was an admission of failure to do what it is that they wanted to do. And that is the real face of this. And that's the real danger here. This is not a victory by Cuba. This is a loss. Because they will not win this power game against the United States. And that's a fact that every person in Latin America, anti-imperialist bloc in South America, is going to have to face. And is going to have to live with the consequences of.